Well, hello and welcome to our session on writing women into history. My name's Alice and I'm a PhD student in the field of music. And today I'm joined by conductor Alice Farnham. Alice is featured on the BBC Women's Hour Music Power List and was listed as one of Classic FM's 10 of today's best women conductors. She's also the co-founder and artistic director of a programme with the Royal Philharmonic Society, Women Conductors. And today we're going to be looking at women's visibility in professional music. So Alice, my first question for you today was really, so what made you want to be a conductor? And could you sort of outline your journey as to how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, it was a very surprising sort of turn of events, really, in that when I was sort of 19, 20, I really didn't expect to be a conductor at all. I was terribly unconfident, certainly sort of physically, standing in front of people and waving my hands around. But I was an organ scholar at university, and part of my job was to conduct the choir in the chapel, and I sort of found in the end that I found that more interesting than actually playing the organ, and I found the sort of communication side of it a more interesting thing to be working on and making music that way. And I also had a lot of interest in orchestral music. I was a trumpeter as well, and I did a lot of trumpet playing. And actually I had a boyfriend who was going to be a conductor and was very sort of ambitious about that. He's actually become a lawyer instead, but I was sort of quite jealous of all the fun that he seemed to be having. So that was sort of initially my desire to do it. But it wasn't so much that I thought I want to be a conductor, but it was more that I found that was where I felt most comfortable and where I felt I could sort of make a difference and perform to the best of my, better than playing the organ, and also just working with musicians in a more collaborative way was more interesting for me.
That's really interesting. Growing up, do you remember seeing any like female conductors, and was the gender of a musician something you ever really thought about growing up?
Well, I mean, it was a difficult. I grew up I was a teenager in the 80s, so we had Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. So it was a very scrambled sort of time. You only need to look at kind of TV adverts of sort of women, sort of semi-naked over sort of a car or something, selling a car and all that sort of stuff and yet we had a female prime minister. So it was a very sort of confusing time for women, I think, for young women, because we were sort of told that we could do everything and that there was absolutely no sort of boundaries, but at the same time the messages were quite conflicting. The person that, of course, I mean, one of the most well-known conductors that was sort of on the TV all the time in the 80s was Jane Glover, who was also actually at the same college as me at Oxford University. And so I sort of growing up, I suppose she was a role model, but she was the only one. And I think I felt that I was at the beginning of a time where, yes, there were very few women, but it was certainly not something that anyone could say, no, you can't do that. But at the same time, it was unusual. Having said that, I was also, being an organist and a trumpeter, I was always doing the things that were traditionally the boys' instruments. So I kind of rather like to buck the trend, I suppose, in that way. And I went to a girls' school, which, maybe helped in a way, in that, I wasn't in competition with other male trumpeters, for example, because there weren't any. And when I did go to do things with other boys' schools and things, I was, it was fine. I didn't feel particularly bothered by that. But in a way, being at a girls' school kind of gave me confidence. On the other hand, it confused me a little because I don't have brothers either. So when I met boys at university, I was quite impressed by their confidence, and I kind of misread that as sort of backed up by huge amounts of knowledge and everything. And it took me a while to realize that it was just the way they were and the way they'd been sort of brought up to behave that was very different from girls who were sort of encouraged to be a bit more modest and not show off as much, which I think is a pity.
Yeah. So this week's session is all about sort of writing women into history. So are there any like historical female conductors or musicians that you don't think are being given the recognition that they deserve for their work?
Well, I think there are many. I mean, I think there are some wonderful composers sort of throughout history, from Hildegard von Bingen, right through to in the 20th. I think now I think female composers are enjoying, rightly so, their place right up there at the top there, scooping up a lot of the prizes and getting good publishers and stuff like that. But I think in history, yes, I think one of the composers that I really love is Elizabeth Lutyens, and I did I conducted a piece of hers about 5 years ago with the Women of the World Orchestra as part of the Women of the World Festival. And she was just, it was amazing music. En Voyage, it was called, and it was a sort of journey, not surprisingly, En Voyage, a journey to Paris, leaving from Victoria Station. And it's wonderful. But it was unbelievably complicated to get the piece performed. So the manager of the orchestra, had a ridiculous paper trail of trying to find out how to get the rights to perform it. Nobody knew who had the rights, but they weren't allowing her to perform it. It was a ridiculous amount of effort. And a couple of years later, I actually wanted to do a similar performance of that. With the BBC Concert Orchestra, and they just said at the notice that we had, they just said, we just can't, it's too complicated to get hold of the music. So this is terrible, because nobody is gaining from that. The music needs to be performed. It's wonderful, it needs to be heard, and it's not possible because of strange legal loopholes that make that. And of course, I'm a great supporter of performing rights, and that's another issue altogether. But if it prevents wonderful music being performed, then there's something wrong there, and nobody seemed to be prepared to sort of really make the effort to change that. So I think a lot of her music in particular has been lost because of that, although she was very well respected as a composer in her day, which wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, it's really disappointing when things like that happen and work's kind of lost over time and things.
Yeah.
So you're obviously a very prominent female conductor today. Are there any other female conductors working that you feel deserve more recognition or credit than they currently receive?
I think there's loads now, actually. I mean, I say loads. The gender ratio is still very low. I mean, when I started the Women Conductors thing, it was 1.4% of women in the UK holding positions with orchestras. I think it's sort of around 5-6% now, so it's gone up enormously, but it's still well under 10%. So I think there's a bit of a skewed idea that the job has been done, because whenever a woman does get a really good position with an orchestra, then there's quite a lot of song and dance made about it. So it makes it seem as if there are more than there really are. There's some wonderful people out there. I mean, Jane Glover, it's wonderful she got a damehood, and also she won the Game Changer Award with the Royal Philharmonic Society. I think Sian Edwards, I mean, she also studied in St. Petersburg with the same teacher as me in Russia, and was incredibly brave. She went sort of, literally behind enemy lines. This was in 1983, into the Soviet Union to study. I mean, no one in Europe, Western Europe, had done that. So it was an incredibly brave thing to do. And she is a wonderful conductor. She does, I think she's very, very well respected in the industry, but I would say she should be higher. She should be given more actually than she really is, I think. But then there's some really wonderful ones coming through. I think for the younger ones, people like Jessica Cottis, Holly Matheson, Tiani Liu, these are all people who are doing really well, and I think I believe it's only a matter of time before they start taking some of the sort of bigger positions, music director jobs and things like that. I don't worry too much, in a way. Often people ask me, oh, you've done a lot to help women, but they're still not getting the big jobs. And I would say that I think we need to take that a little bit slowly, because you can't make a conductor in a few years. It takes many, many years to train and to gain that experience. And if we push it too much, then I think people will be getting jobs that they're not ready for.
Yeah.
And we don't want that to happen, because it all sort of backfires. So yeah, I think that's coming through. I mean, it's a terribly difficult profession, because it's very sort of unregulated and unregulatable, really. It's very hard to say who's sort of not done so well. I mean, one of my heroes when I was in the 90s, Sian Edwards, was a great role model for me, but there was also Andrea Quinn, who's a wonderful conductor and was music director of the Royal Ballet, went to New York City Ballet to be music director there. And she still conducts quite a bit of ballet, but not a huge amount anymore. And I think she's got, family and other focuses as well. But I feel that it's a pity that her career, maybe she chose that, and that's fine, but I feel like she deserved to have a bigger career than she may have done.
Thank you. Well, I've been reading about your programme, Women Conductors, with the Royal Philharmonic Society. I think it's something that's so important. In order to get more gender equality, we really need to encourage young girls to get involved in and continue with their musical activities. So what made you want to start this programme, and do you think it's working the way you wanted it to?
Yeah, it was a real light bulb moment, actually, because it was when Marin Alsop conducted the last night of the proms, and suddenly, this was in 2013, so the first time she conducted it in September, and everybody was kind of really shocked. I mean, outside the classical music world, we all knew that there were very few women, but the rest of the world sort of said, what's going on here? Why are there no women? This is the first woman ever to conduct the last night of the proms. This is ridiculous. And then one conductor, Vasily Petrenko, was quoted it was sort of unfortunate. I think it was actually an interview in English translated into Norwegian and back into English again. And English is not his first language either. So with all that aside, he said something about a woman on the podium is distracting. A cute girl on the podium is distracting for conductors and for an orchestra. And this kind of created a huge furore. And I was invited to speak on Radio 4 on the World Tonight evening programme to talk about this and what my views were. And I said, look, this is just a profession that not many women want to do. And in the 20 years, it was 2013, so I had graduated from university in 1993, so it was exactly 20 years. And I had left in 93 and, wanting to pursue conducting and thinking, well, it's going to change in those 20 years. And I suddenly realized, I had this sort of moment where I suddenly realized, actually, it really hasn't changed at all. So the women that were working as conductors were probably doing a bit better than they were 20 years ago, but the numbers were tiny, really, really small. And I just thought, gosh, this is ridiculous. And I woke up the next morning after the interview and I thought, well, I need to change this. And I simply need to encourage more women into it, because as I said, when I started conducting, I was very, very nervous about it. And actually, it was because I kind of had to do it that I took that plunge because I was an organist and I had to conduct the choir and stuff, that I had to take that plunge. And I think I was sort of very stubborn, and I was used to doing boys' things. So I was kind of lucky in that way, but I realized that there were probably a lot of women students who wanted to work as musicians, as professional musicians, but who didn't necessarily have the courage to really, or even think about the fact that they could become conductors. And so I was running a opera school at Morley College. There's a small part-time opera course there, and Morley College is an adult education college founded by women, actually. And I went to the head of music, Andrea Brown, and I said, look, I think we should start a course for women. And she said, yeah, that's a good idea. We kind of run roughshod over everyone and just basically announced it to the press without checking that we were allowed to do it. and it kind of very quickly got a huge amount of attention and grew very quickly. And the Royal Philharmonic Society, I then approached them because I realized it needed a sort of bigger home, because we wanted to, we already had started sort of working with different partners around the country, different conservatoires, but it was really tough because I was pretty much, I mean, Andrea Brown was enormously supportive as the music director, but she went on to actually in fact study conducting full time, and now has a career as a choral conductor. But I realized it was taking up enormous amounts of my time, and I needed a home for it where we could sort of have that support and influence. And I was basically just calling in favors of people that I knew in various conservatoires, and and just I kind of had a naivety about it, really. I just thought, well, I'm going to just make this happen, and I just believed so strongly that it was the right thing to do. And it was in a way a simple idea, because I think what I wanted to be really careful about was not to sort of seem like I was complaining, because I had quite a tough time, forging a career had not been an easy thing to do at all. And I didn't want to feel that I was making it all about me trying to get work. But what I wanted to say is, look, very few women want to train as conductors. So why don't we encourage more of them to do that? And let's run short workshops just to give them a little taste of what it is to be a conductor. These need to be women who are very good musicians, who are in training to become professional musicians, but they might not even see themselves as quote unquote leaders, but they might really secretly have a desire to do it. So we started with that, with young student sort of age people right through to late 20s. But then I actually got approached by lots of older women, more my age, in 40s and older, or in their 30s, and saying, oh, I really wanted to be a conductor, but I was told I wasn't allowed to, or I was discouraged, and can't you run courses for us as well? So of course we felt that was fair enough, a good point. So we started running those. And I mean, it's all a bit on hold at the moment, of course, with COVID. We can't actually run anything. But there are other sort of things that have come out of that. So many things, actually. So here in the UK, we've partnered with the Royal Opera House. We partnered with lots of different organisations, actually, but the Royal Opera House has sort of taken their thing, developed that a little bit. And continue, and they've managed even to run some master classes and workshops, even back in October, actually. And also Sian Edwards at the Royal Academy of Music, she's sort of taking the stuff that I've been doing, and she and I, together with some sponsorship from the Sorrel Foundation, have been running courses for women who are on that path. Many of them have actually done my workshops, and they want to apply to study postgrad. And she had noticed that there were some very talented women there, but they weren't quite up to speed compared to the men. They hadn't quite elbowed their way into getting experience, or they just lacked a bit of confidence. So the last few years, Sian and I have been working with some of those students. We did an online thing a couple of weekends ago, but I think we're hoping to meet in person maybe in the spring. And then in Ireland, there's a wonderful course there, which I'm also artistic director of, that is funded by Grant Thornton accountancy, and that's the National Concert Hall in Dublin, and it's sort of been we pressed hold on it a year ago nearly, and we've been doing lots of online stuff since then, and trying to keep things afloat, which we have. I think it's been useful, but we're hoping again to be meeting at some point this year to finish that, and that's developing into other things. And then there are things all over the world, I mean, that are sort of burgeoning. There's also something in Australia that came about sort of out of that, and Perth Symphony Orchestra. So I went over there at the end of February, and last year, and now I teach. I've been doing some masterclasses actually with them in person. So they actually have they had a small orchestra, even far back as June, because they sort of opened up again. And so I taught them on the screen, like a kind of Big Brother screen. It was really fun. And did quite a few of those. And I've been doing lots of online teaching actually, which is doable. It works. So yeah, it's developed. It's one of those funny things where I suppose I kind of knew it was a good idea. I just knew it was a good idea. And I knew that my background meant that I would be able to help people because I wasn't naturally confident myself. I had to find it in myself. And so I kind of knew that it would somehow work, but I didn't expect it to sort of continue for so long. And I guess I didn't really think actually about the overall plan. I just felt, right, we're going to do this, and I hope that in sort of 5-10 years time we won't need to exist anymore.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So do you think there's still a lot that needs to be done still to sort of encourage and ensure women are getting the recognition and sort of credit they deserve, or do you think that's just something that's going to take time now?
I think there's work that needs to be done. I think it needs to be a sort of continuous conversation actually, because the things from 2013, it was a very different story to now. So the needs are different and the conversation is different. So what I had found, let's say 10 years ago, was I was kind of invisible. So I would, apply for things, or generally can't apply for jobs. They don't happen like that. It was word of mouth, but I would network and I would just be like, no one's listening to me, kind of thing. I felt invisible. And I think now people are looking out for women conductors, but I think sometimes it's done a bit as a sort of tick box exercise, which doesn't help anybody. Having said that, I think, if it's a case of having to push a bit of a quota for a little while just to really shift stuff, because people would say to me, oh, but these things will just happen naturally. I don't think they do. And that was my feeling, back in 2013, when I realized it hadn't changed since 1993. I thought, well, it isn't going to change unless we actually do something. The only person then that was doing things was Marin Alsop, who continues to, and I've worked with her a bit, and she's absolutely was sort of looking at that issue before any of us were. She was very, very aware of it and took on the responsibility of that. But I think it continues to develop, and it's still something, I have to say, sad to say, that people still make really ridiculous comments like, somebody said to me, oh, you're women can't conduct because their breasts get in the way. And that was 20 years ago, but I've even as recently as a few months ago, that comment or similar comment was made to a conductor. So that would be illegal in a kind of work position, really. So I think there are still real issues that need to be discussed. But I think sometimes we have to also be aware of the other factors for young conductors. One of which is not actually is the cost of sort of training as a conductor is very expensive. The cost of getting experience is really tough, and I think young conductors need to be either extremely entrepreneurial or well connected, or there's all sorts of barriers to conducting, which for young men as well. And so I think the discussion of sort of inclusivity needs to develop as more women come into the profession and feel empowered to come in, because they are beginning to. Yeah. But when I talk to younger women, I sort of would like to think, oh, it's easy as anything for them, but they'll still say, oh no, this was said to me, and this is, and I've had this problem and that problem. So the problems haven't all disappeared overnight.
Yeah, my final question is, so during my master's dissertation, I sort of looked at the phenomenon of women having their gender specified and referring to their role, which I find an incredibly sexist practice. So does it bother you when people refer to you as a female conductor rather than just as a conductor?
Yes, it used to really annoy me because I just wanted to be, and it was things like, they say, oh, is it conductress if you're a woman? And I say, no, that's just the buses. And all those kind of comments, oh, you're a woman conductor, as if, what to say to that. Having said that, I mean, I think as the age that, my mid 40s, as I was when I started the program, I felt, well, it's okay, I don't mind talking about this now. But just as actually I was recently talking to an mixed race African American conductor, and he was saying that, he's young, and he just said, I just want to be a conductor and I don't want to have that label. And as we were talking, we sort of acknowledged the fact that perhaps these are things that it's easier once you're established to start sort of saying, yes, I'm a woman and I've done this, but you don't want to be sort of shouting that from the rooftops while you're trying to get noticed. And I'm not afraid to talk about it. I mean, I used to be really afraid to talk about it, but I'm not anymore. But I think that's because of the age I'm at now. And the problem is, I mean, with, orchestral auditions, you get, there's often a lot of orchestras do the blind auditions where the people auditioning for the orchestra will be behind a screen, so that no one on the panel will be able to see. Although apparently things like you can tell by the type of shoes they've got as they walk to the moment, whatever. But still, the blind audition can help. But of course, you can't do a blind audition for a conductor. And anyway, conductors generally don't audition. It's all sort of through word of mouth. So it's quite impossible to get away from the fact that you're male or female. But I certainly hope there'll be a point, and I think it's beginning to happen, there'll be a point where, just as if I say, oh, I went to see the doctor today. No, but I don't think people think, oh, that was probably a man. I don't think they make that sort of unconscious biased decision, that thought, oh, that should be talking about a man. They'll, a doctor will be either, and I'd love that to be. But until the idea of women conductors is normalized, and there are so many, that it's not, because at the moment I think it is a kind of idea that, oh, there aren't many, so when we're still a thing, it's still a thing people talk about. And I had last year, or the year before actually, a couple of people said to me, oh, there are so many women conductors now, it's a tsunami of women conductors, which I just felt was the weirdest thing, because it's sort of, I mean, tsunamis are not good things at all. And also, when we're talking about a gender ratio of about 6%, I don't think tsunami is really a very accurate description of it either. So until that's normalized, I think sometimes we just have to put up with that for a little while. And again, I think, we keep that conversation going and hopefully it will change.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time today, Alice. I think that's all the questions I have for you. It's been really great to chat about this sort of really important and really interesting subject with you.
What about your research into it? I mean, what have you been found?
I'm doing my PhD on instrumental choice. So sort of looking at why girls choose to play sort of certain instruments and the historical links to different instruments. So I'm just about to start my primary research. So I haven't started any of that yet, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of it.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the whole thing of the fact that I was talking about trumpet and the trumpet and the organ, and that sort of, well, in the case of the brass players, it's a sort of laddish culture, I suppose, and in the case of the organ, it's more to do with the church music history and the church's history, I suppose, of a male-dominated area, I suppose. But it still hasn't changed hugely.
No.
Are you looking at what happens to the leaders of when they get, so the section leaders, so you maybe get more female string players, but then when they get into the higher positions,
It drops off again, yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. I'm kind of focused more on sort of children and looking at what we can put in place to sort of make young girls think it's okay to branch out, because I think it's very interesting that we don't perpetuate those gender stereotypes deliberately anymore, and yet young girls are still choosing to pick those stereotypical instruments.
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it?
Mm.
I wonder why that is. And are there instruments that are completely not, that tend to be much more evenly balanced?
Other than the strings, I mean, the strings are reasonably well balanced, but
Yeah.
other than that, my current research, what I've seen so far, is that there's still big gender splits
Mm.
across the
And
board, really.
yeah. And what about with just actual the take up of instruments? Are there more girls that do it than boys anyway?
I'm not sure. It's something I want to look into.
Yeah. Because it does seem like music is, sometimes seen as a sort of girls thing to do type.
I've read that girls tend to take it up more when they're young, but don't see it as a possible career path, so then drop it before taking it further,
Right.
whereas boys see it as a possible career, which is
Yeah.
interesting, but we'll see if the research kind of backs that up or not.
Yeah, and I wonder whether just the idea of possible careers is just much narrower for women still,
Mm.
which would be a bit depressing, wouldn't it? I
Mm.
mean, in anything, like in any, yeah, let's hope. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much for your time.
No, it's a pleasure.